Hello, listeners of the Mad Scientist Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cogswell, here with my co-host, Marie Mayhew. Marie,
what's up?
We're still not dead.
We're still alive for this moment. Yeah.
It's so exciting.
Yeah, we joke. We're all ha 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 ha. Look at us still surviving.
I know.
Still playing with fire.
It's just a matter of time.
Let's do it again.
The fire is only going to get hotter this episode.
Idiots.
Dear listeners.
Man. Idiots.
This episode, we are going to talk about. So last episode, we started off by talking about Robert Bigelow's early history, and we got from essentially him as a kid. His grandparents had this UFO experience. It affected him greatly. He then gets up to allegedly had this UFO experience. Maybe he just fell in love with atomic blast, or maybe he just loved space in general. Right. Any of these options, right? Up to the tragic death of his son, Rod. Mm-hmm. This episode, we're tracking from essentially from that point in 92 up to about 96 with the founding of what's called NIDS, the National Institute of Discovery Science, which famously worked on the Skinwalker Ranch after Bigelow purchased the property in 95. And so the way that we're going to do this episode, it's a little challenging because there are so many moving parts to this. There's like 10 different researchers in NIDS, all of whom could have an episode done on them individually, really. But we're going to focus on a couple of them. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to first talk about Bigelow and his kind of doings up to the founding of NIDS. Then we're going to break down two of the biggest players in NIDS for you. Harold Pudoff, or Hal Pudoff, and John Alexander, Colonel John Alexander. We're going to focus on those. We're going to focus on those two because they tend to be, I would argue, they are the most important of the NIDS members, besides maybe John Schuessler, who will also cover, but essentially he's a founding member of MUFON. He's very involved in the UFO field. And that's how he kind of comes on board with NIDS, is his involvement in UFOs. The other two, however, come on board not because of their involvement in UFOs, but because of their involvement in the world of parapsychology, which is an interesting part of this whole story. Now, we don't know exactly how Bigelow meets these people, but we have pretty good suppositions as to how they're connected and some good anecdotal evidence to point the way there. But again, we can't point to a specific event that says, this is when Robert Bigelow met Hal Pudoff and they decided they were going to look for aliens together. We don't have anything like that.
In the library with the candlestick.
Yeah, right? Yeah, so this is essentially going to be almost like our version of the Justice League of kooks, but we're going to hopefully do it a little bit better than they did the Justice League movie. Anyways.
God, I hope so. I wish we had half their budget.
I'm telling you, seriously, right? It'd be so good if we had half their budget. A tenth of their budget, this would be awesome.
Who would be Aquaman?
Ooh.
Just throwing it out there.
Aquaman, I think, has got to be... No, I don't think Alexander. Alexander's like the one that secretly does have a lot of power, but Alexander's like Martian Manhunter. Or maybe the Flash. He doesn't get a lot of love, but he's kind of fun in interviews.
He's still credible.
And he's really powerful.
He's sort of quirky, yeah.
Yeah, Bigelow is definitely Superman. He's kind of overwrought in specialty and everything else. I would almost argue Pudoff is Aquaman because people are trying to make him happen right now, but it's just not going to happen. It's just not that cool, and there's not a lot there.
Trying to make Aquaman happen.
Yeah, I don't know though. I don't know. And then I guess that would make us the Legion of Doom.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Which is awesome.
Far too much credit, but okay.
All right. Let's roll the tape, Jake. Who would Jake be in Legion of Doom? I feel like...
Didn't Morrison write Legion of Doom?
Yeah,
no, Doom Patrol.
Doom Patrol. That's different. Yeah, no, I think, honestly, Legion of Doom, I would argue, I don't know, maybe Jake is Brainiac, because he's kind of the brains behind the technical stuff and everything else. I would argue I'm Gorilla Grodd, because I'm very hairy, and I walk, so according to Katie, I walk like a gorilla at nighttime to the bathroom. Like in those
Katie's
YouTube
like,
videos of gorillas walking.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for disclosing that for the American public.
And then Maria, I guess that makes you Lex Luthor.
I'm bald. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm bald. I'm bald and evil. Why not? And the other thing is, I am so much more Marvel than I am DC. Even before Marvel was a thing. I liked it before it was a thing.
You know, so did I. But then I go back and I read the comics that I go back and read now that still are good are the DC ones, like the old Batmans and stuff. And if I read old Marvel, I'm almost embarrassed by how corny they are. Like reading the Dark Phoenix saga again, I was like, oh my god, I can't believe I thought this was so dark and gritty and cool.
X-Men is sort of a different, like, that's even sort of a little bit more standalone. Like, I don't know. When I was younger, I did love Spider-Man. I loved
Spider-Man's the best
series, right? Because I just thought that was awesome.
All right, Bigelow. So the effect of the death of his son is undoubtedly significant, and it's definitely a part of what drives him, it seems. However, we showed in the previous episode that he was already doing this kind of research. He was already starting to fund research into UFOs by like the mid 1980s. So there is a prevailing rumor out there in the UFO community that he starts getting involved because of the death of his son, but there's just no way that's true. We have documentation that he was already involved before that. Maybe it's because of his son's interest that he becomes extremely involved in things. However, and he thinks about, maybe making a name for himself to leave like a legacy or something. But it's very, very, I think it's very inaccurate to say that he becomes interested in this because of the death of his son. I don't think that's true. So
yeah. Well, I would say I think it's hard to pinpoint any one thing. I think that could be a propellant in this type of, of wanting to know something or trying to understand something better. He definitely became more visible during that time, spending money to accelerate things. So I think there is something to it. I don't know if it's the thing we think it is.
No,
I think that's the problem. Is it's like we don't know what that looks like, but it could be something that is just again like this more. I don't want to say public show, but this more of a outpouring of trying to understand things and trying to fund things that we're going to be getting into.
Absolutely, yeah. So we know that in 1990 he was doing research with MUFON already. And especially, essentially the higher ups in MUFON too, like not mid-level people. He wasn't like going to a local meeting. He was working with the heads of MUFON. So that's probably where he met John Schuessler. And he ends up actually helping to fund in 92 a really significant abduction research conference at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So it's famously one of, I think, the most significant kind of scientific studies of the event. And it kind of focuses on a couple of different things that Bigelow actually helped to fund, including an abductee kind of research survey. And then later on, with Alexander, a research survey of religious figures in the United States. But so Bigelow helps to fund and attends this conference at MIT. There, he certainly would have at least met with John Alexander, although it's said in some places that Alexander actually helped start that conference as well. So maybe they were already working together there. However, this is where, at least by 92, he would have already have met and known Jacques Vallée, John Alexander, John Schuessler, so a couple of the big names in NIDS. He's also, though, simultaneously funding other societies. So he starts funding the Rhine Research Center for Consciousness Studies, the Society for Scientific Exploration, which is a foundation actually started by Hal Puthoff. So that's likely how he met him, through this, again, kind of analysis and stuff. He becomes involved with the Mars Society, which the Mars Society, and actually also with the Space Transportation Association, both specifically in the space tourism divisions. So he's interested in making space hotels, right? The thing that he's always said he wanted to do. Yeah.
Early on.
And so the Mars Society is actually a group of people who get together to say that we should be traveling to Mars. right? We should be colonizing Mars for human habitation and study and everything else. And then
As
also
you do.
he becomes involved with the Nevada Test Site Association. So this is also where likely he would have met some of the other big names in NIDS, Edgar Mitchell, like actual scientists and astronauts. So it's
Actual
this is
scientists. Why were you air quoting the other ones?
I'm not gonna say anything yet, Marie.
This is where he met real scientists. Sorry.
But so
Damn.
this is probably where he would have met people like Jim Winery, who becomes part of NIDS, of course. Where he would have met people like again John Alexander, not John Alexander. Sorry, I mean of course John Alexander as well, but also some other folks, right? So Martin Pilch may be there. He might have met some others. So, anyways, he then at the same time, supposedly, Bigelow is funding a very interesting little group on a radio show called Area 2000. This funding starts in 1993. This group would become really important to the Bigelow legacy and story. It's a radio show with George Knapp, Linda Moulton Howe, and Art Bell. It's essentially the beginnings of Coast to Coast AM. So Bigelow helps fund them for this radio show, supposedly, in 1993. He stops funding them a year later because funnily enough, I think the quote that I found was that he didn't think that they would have enough good people to interview anymore after the first year. And then Coast to Coast AM continued for 20 years and it's still going on. So it's an interesting part of the story here.
I just love that original name. It's so perfectly, of the time.
Really, right? Like Area 2000.
Sure.
Hilarious.
2000.
The show would later morph into Dreamland, which would then become Coast to Coast AM. But this is where he continues his work with George Knapp and Linda Moulton Howe, especially, who are going to become important parts of the story. He also, though, is dabbling in normal philanthropy. Like, he's starting to give money to actual other societies. He's not just funding UFO stuff. So
Right.
he actually donates 2 buildings to the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. The Bigelow Physics Building and the Rod Lee Bigelow Health Sciences Building, both of which still bear those names.
Yep.
So he's also giving money, and he is giving money to politicians and things, and primarily Republicans, but Harry Reid, of course, he's giving money to. He's just kind of building up his. What did we say last time, right? He's good at greasing palms. He's good at the political stuff.
Yep.
He's just building up that base of people for.
He's a collector.
He is.
Right? He's
That's actually
collecting.
a
He's
fascinating
collecting people.
way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah, he's collecting everything. Like, that's how, if you look at sort of how he acquired buildings and how he acquired, again, just anything that he did, how he met people or stuff we get into later, it's not so much like a hoarder. Because like you said, if it's not working, he's like, he dumps it. But I think it's interesting because he definitely has this sort of collector and connoisseur of figuring out people's usefulness and taking note of it and then coming back to it later.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And interestingly enough, actually, so from this point on, things are going to get a little bit dicey to pull apart truth from friction. Jake, cut it out. It's gonna.
That's the best. How do you separate the truth from friction?
Jake, leave it in. This part in the story is where things start to get really hard to pick apart the truth from the fiction, and the reason for that is because of a, dare I say it, pencil-headed nerd named Richard Doty.
Nerds.
Doty is famously involved in the Paul Benowitz affair, which Rob alluded to in our first episode, and we frankly just don't have the time to go over it as part of this series. However, we're going to create it as a bonus episode, the whole Richard Doty thing. That's going to go out to the Patreon first, and then a month later we'll go out to full listeners of the show. So get ready for that in your feeds. However, a lot of what Bigelow funds, and a lot of the people Bigelow's working with, George Knapp, Linda Moulton Howe, Hal Puthoff, John Alexander, all these people, appear to have gotten involved with a individual named Rick Doty, who would, in the year 2000, and with Bill Moore, a ufologist with MUFON, who around the year like 1989, 1990, 2000, will come out and say, in that period, will come out and say that he has been paid by the United States Air Force. He worked for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. He will come out and say that he has been feeding disinformation to these people in the UFO field for years. The point of which is to hide actual government programs that are ongoing. So, it is nearly impossible to tell if any of the stuff that these people find or work on is true or valuable or anything. It's just impossible at this point. So
crazy. It's fascinating because it's like a conspiracy theory right there, right?
Yeah, and
anytime you disprove it, you prove it stronger, or trying to prove it, you're a shill.
Yes, and part of the problem becomes that individuals like, say, Hal Puthoff and John Alexander, and Bigelow to a lesser extent, but mostly these other two, become part of that mythology in that Bill Moore will claim that they are also disinformation agents, purposely put into the UFO community to spread lies. Now, we don't know if that's true. We have no way of knowing either way. Richard, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it seems like if that was really the case,
just saying, it's a lot of work.
It seems like if that was really the case, these people would not be so committed to the field as they are still. So I'm edging on the side that that's probably not true, but we're going to cover it in a bonus episode. But anyways, just keep that in the back of your mind for all of this Bigelow stuff from this point forward, essentially. That all of the stuff he has been funding up to this point, some guys come out and been like, haha, I've been tricking you to hide drone technology in the desert. So keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the year 1992, Bigelow will begin what is called the Bigelow Foundation, which is impossible to find any good information on because there are two way bigger and more successful foundations called the Bigelow Foundation out there, one of which is run by the Bigelow Tea Company, and one of which is run by the F.R. Bigelow family here in St. Paul, Minnesota. That's it.
And I think he also put a lot of other work entities under the Bigelow Foundation.
He had
the Bigelow Trust. He had sort of, again, he was pretty good at masking what he was doing with shell companies. I think in some ways. And again, allegedly, pure speculation on my part, but you have someone with so much wealth, and they're very nimble, and he runs sort of this very small organization that's not publicly held. So it seems like if you start to kind of follow his money a little bit and look into all of the places that he was, looking at opening hotels, they're all under different names, but they all kind of roll up to a trust or a foundation or something like that.
Yeah,
which is fascinating.
It's very interesting. So, he also starts a lot of these companies with seemingly random people. Marie, have you confirmed that these people are real?
Go Lightly?
Yeah.
Mr. Go Lightly? I think he is.
Okay, so
I believe that he is.
So
I think we need to do a little bit more of a deep dive on it, but anyone who he's putting on a trust or he's making the officer in a shareholder, or again, he's putting them on the board, or he's making them a director, it's a real person.
Well, so here's the thing though. I don't think it's actually the person that becomes on the board. It's the Ricky L. Golightly Foundation. Right.
So,
Ricky L. Golightly is a corporation too.
but Ricky L. Golightly is also a person who sits on his board of a lot of different
okay.
a lot of different things.
So the reason we bring this up is that Bigelow, in using some pseudonyms and also shell companies and everything else, the telltale sign that this is a Bigelow company is that Ricky L. Golightly is on the board. So he is on the board of he's a secretary of Budget Suites of America. He's on the board of NIDS. Mm-hmm. He's on the board for the Center for Space Sciences, the Bigelow Foundation, the Bigelow Family Foundation, just all kinds of stuff that Bigelow is also involved in. So, it's a good way of kind of, honestly, it's more effective to search for Golightly in public records than it is to search for Bigelow when trying to find that stuff, because he comes up everywhere, and I don't think it's a very common name.
No, right? Again, but it's one of those things where it casts enough aspersion that you're like, is he real? So this would be somebody that Bigelow would have to be in communication with on a fairly frequent basis and would have to have a high amount of trust in to be doing all of this, right? Because this person's not just some sort of some sort of a patsy. This is clearly somebody who he trusts enough that he's giving some sort of, some sort of financial purview to. So I have a feeling it is a real person, but then you're like, the dude's name is Golightly. How, then you're trying to find him and you're like, I can't even believe I'm looking for somebody named Golightly. This doesn't make, and you're like, no, it's not Breakfast at Tiffany's. Keep finding that. But I also think this was happening. He was using all of this before internet search, right? Mm-hmm. Before he knew. I have a feeling, the new whatever he's doing now, or however he's sort of anonymizing his money and how he places his money. He's probably using a lot simpler names than Golightly.
Yeah, probably a lot of acronyms. Anyways, so. One of the interesting things, so the Bigelow Foundation becomes his method, essentially, of funding paranormal research. So, through the Bigelow Foundation, he hires people to do research in near-death experiences. He brings on people, again, to Bigelow Aerospace to give these kinds of talks and things. But one of the most important things that the Bigelow Foundation will do is the creation of a Department of Consciousness Studies. Specifically a chair of consciousness studies. It's not really a department, but a program in consciousness studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And so it's through this that he will end up meeting a lot of the other NIDS players that appear on the outset to be, what's the word? They appear to be completely unaffiliated scientists with Robert Bigelow, which is what helps to give the group some credence. However, they become involved because Bigelow is giving them, in their university, just comical sums of money. So, again, the lure of a rich guy with money, if you're a scientist, we know this from Epstein, right? Mm-hmm. Even if the ideas are just out of this world nuts. Epstein creating a clone army of himself because he thinks he's the perfect human specimen, right? With enough money, you can get even the best scientists of the day to come and listen to your crazy shit. So, it's not, to me, the inclusion of these people is not all that interesting, I guess. Because, of course, they'd be involved. This guy's going to give them a bunch of money to study stuff, Why not? Why not hear him out?
Yeah, but I think that's true, but I also think that he's probably pretty discerning on who he would bring on board and give this money to.
Oh, 100%. He's not. He is. We know from Lazard that when he smells a fraud, he pulls money immediately.
Right.
So,
right. But he's giving something to, he's giving millions and millions of dollars to something that is really just not any sort of proven anything. It's not even hypothetical. It's a lot of it is. It doesn't, human consciousness, the Consciousness Project, it's how do you even go about thinking that that's something that you could substantiate in some ways? What's the PowerPoint deck that you would give to Robert Bigelow for that? You'd be like, okay, so, it's that's insane that he would give that money and that he would validate. I would take the money, of course, if I was on the scientist side, but it's to me, it's just, I don't know. That's interesting.
Well, and psychology is one of the few fields where these kinds of questions are taken, I think, a little bit more seriously just on the outset, because the idea of studying consciousness and extreme conscious experiences, that's not that out of the ordinary for the psychological fields. That's kind of been a running theme, kind of a subcurrent in the psychological sciences since Freud. So I don't think that's that crazy to think that these people would be interested in this, but I do think, like you're saying, he is extremely discerning in who he gives the money to.
Yes.
So one of his first hires at the Bigelow Foundation, and actually one of the few people we know for sure, or at least will come out and say that she worked there, besides Colonel John Alexander's wife, is Dr. Angela Smith. So she is a psychologist who initially was working at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, or PEAR, as it was called. That group studied parapsychology, again, kind of in the late 80s, early 90s. Their main testing method involved the use of a random number generator to see if participants could affect the numbers that would be shot out. So imagine, Marie, first off, a random number generator, that doesn't really mean what people think it means in terms of modern day, where a computer is spitting out random things. A true random number generator works on true randomness, like entropy, right? And so it's essentially you have a system where some physical, a uncontrollable physical system is operating that will then cause a random signal to develop. Right. So, for instance, imagine like a material that's irradiating its surroundings or shooting out electrons or something. Right. As it decays, those decay products will move about randomly because of, again, quantum mechanics and things. And so you can collect that signal and it can be transferred into or transformed into a random number. Right. So, a number between, say, 1 to 10 that'll give randomness. So
it's not like picking a card. Is that what you're telling me?
No, it's not. It's not like picking a card at all. And actually, that is going to be one of the problems with the work that Hal Puthoff does. Is that his method is much closer to picking out a card. So,
he's not. Are you saying he's not, quote unquote, a real scientist?
I'm not saying allegedly, Marie. Allegedly. So there's what are known as true random number generators and then pseudo random number generators. The true ones are, again, a physical phenomena. So some other ones also are atmospheric noise, thermal noise, cosmic radiation, background radiation is another one that can be used for that. But essentially, it's just you're essentially pulling out things that are affected by entropy, and so you're getting true randomness to be studied. And so what these studies would do is they would have people kind of sit in an area and try to predict or force the random number generator to give out a number of their choosing. Right? And so in that test, then, you can actually measure and see, well, did the number 4 come out more often than any other number? And if that is statistically significant, then that is a very compelling argument for psychic powers.
How did that work?
What do you mean? How did it work? It didn't work. It didn't show anything, right? The lab closed. The lab closed in 5 years, Marie. It did not happen, or not 5 years. This is a different one. The one Bigelow founded closed in 5 years. Actually, they have one of my favorite Wikipedia entries ever, and I'm gonna read it in its entirety really quickly. It's just a little paragraph. So, quote: PEAR's primary purpose was to engage in parapsychological exercises on topics such as psychokinesis and remote viewing. The program had a strained relationship with Princeton and was considered an embarrassment to the university. And that has 4 citations. PEAR's activities have been criticized for a lack of scientific rigor, poor methodology, and misuse of statistics. 3 citations. And have been characterized as pseudoscience. The main citation on the Wikipedia article, end quote. Damn! Wikipedia dropping the damn mic, Marie. So It's not great. This is one of a number of these kind of programs that'll pop up that attempt to study these things with any kind of scientific rigor. And they inevitably seem to fail. Some are still going and are actually quite interesting in my opinion, and we can do a whole episode on those kinds of societies and things. However, the random number generator stuff never really gets off the ground. There's actually a famous case of it supposedly on the days before 9/11. All of the random number generators at these psychic places were outputting numbers at a higher statistical frequency than they were previously, or something crazy like that.
No.
It's not true, right? It's just a meme story that floated around the internet before the attacks, or after the attacks, I should say. But whatever. So, anyways, the chair of consciousness studies is actually in particular heralded by one of the deans of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, whose name is Warren Berggren, PhD, and he will become a part of NIDS. So he is quoted here in a University of Nevada, Las Vegas kind of press release, quote, "This area of study is really commanding a lot of interest and excitement. We're starting to see more interest in the scientific and philosophical sides of understanding human consciousness. Some very serious universities are engaged in the scientific study of consciousness, but not many. So the Bigelows have presented our students with a unique opportunity. It is definitely a prize for UNLV," end quote. The first director of the program is Charles Tart, and then he leaves after a couple years and it becomes chaired by Raymond Moody, both of whom are basically... both of whom essentially are parapsychologists who are interested in the study of near-death experiences and kind of consciousness, like remote viewing, all those kinds of things. So really his first big study, or Bigelow's first really big funding, is not in UFOs. I mean, he funds this other stuff, and he starts funding Lazar and everything else. But another big part of this story is the consciousness, is the psychology and the parapsychology world that he's also very interested in. So the fund will eventually close after 5 years. It closes because no results come from the studies, essentially. Nothing is publishable. Nothing is, of scientific interest. So it closes down, and they turn it instead into a scholarship fund for students. So again, like Bigelow is doing, this is good. This is real philanthropy here. It just it doesn't pan out the way that he wants. So at the same time,
it's a lot of money.
It is a lot of
still
money.
Giving up a lot of money. Yeah.
So another thing that the Bigelow Foundation funds is what's known as the Bigelow Foundation Survey, also known as the Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey, which essentially becomes it's essentially meant to study how I think it's rabbis, Roman Catholic priests, and Protestant ministers believe UFO contact will affect their faithful. So will this be a religious issue for them? The study, actually, it's really interesting. The study itself never really gets analyzed. They just kind of collect the data, which happens a lot in UFO circles, frankly. It's easy to collect data. It's hard to analyze it in a rigorous way. So then what happens, actually, is that later on, Charles Tart, again, the head of the Bigelow Consciousness Studies, or the chair of Consciousness Studies, the first chair of that, he actually ends up writing a paper where he analyzes it and finds that, in fact, based on the survey results, religious leaders don't believe that there will be a negative effect of disclosure on religiousness in the United States. So, anyway, it's kind of an interesting thing. So, at this point now, 94, Bigelow starts hearing about Bigelow doesn't start hearing about it, and we're going to get into this in the next episode some more when we get to the ranch. But Skinwalker Ranch becomes a publicly known item.
Yes. It becomes more, yes. We don't know, at this point, you just know more about the ranch. You don't know about who's funding it, what's going on with it, stuff like that. Right.
But stories about the ranch start popping up. So one of the first ones is in the Deseret News, which is a Salt Lake City newspaper. Stories are written about it by, say, George Knapp, but we don't know how this happens, And so at this point in time, Bigelow, he eventually will buy the ranch, of course. At the same time, he helps found the UFO Research Coalition, a short-lived UFO research group containing the members of MUFON, Q-Force, and FU4, which is the Fund for UFO Research, which still exists. Q-Force kind of still exists. That was started by, oh my God, not John Keel, Hynek, J. Allen Hynek, and then MUFON, of course, which Schuessler is involved in, Carpenter, everyone else. But this is a group that's meant to kind of bring all the camps together, and like all good UFO stories, the camps then immediately start infighting and it disintegrates. So,
of course,
good times. And then
you finally get something that can bring everyone together. That's the first problem you're gonna have.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So, at the same time, though, interestingly,
it's universal. Like when the aliens do come down and land, that's the first thing that they can, that we can draw them to, that we've been able to agree on.
Right. Look, none of us like anyone else. It's perfect. We can't be
Nobody
in groups
likes anybody else's ideas.
We can't be in groups of more than 10 or we start killing each other. Cool. Welcome to Earth.
I would even say 7. Maybe.
Yeah, 10's high. So at this point then, 94, Bigelow has also started putting out ads in scientific journals looking for scientists who are interested in studying anomalous phenomena. In particular, he places one in the magazine Science, which is not only a magazine, it's a journal, a scientific journal. And that is where one Colm Kelleher will say that he first becomes introduced to Bigelow. He sees this ad, he becomes intrigued, and he contacts the team, and eventually will join NIDS. And so that gets us to 95, where NIDS starts. Now, we've already shown, and we've discussed here, that it's very likely that he was already working with some of these people, and some of them he certainly was already working with. But we're going to go through some of these names here. So this is the full list of members of NIDS, based on their website on the Wayback Machine. We're going to go through all the members now, and then we're going to go through 2 people in particular. So, of course, you have Warren Berggren, who is an animal physiologist by training. So he is that previous dean of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He's the dean of the Department of Science, like an interim dean. And he's the one that's there when that chair of consciousness studies is formed. So that's how he kind of knows Bigelow. You also have Douglas P. Ferraro, another PhD, who was the provost of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a psychologist. So again, obviously, part of Bigelow's circle here. He's giving away philanthropy monies to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. That's how they know him. We then have Albert A. Harrison, who is a psychologist who's known specifically for his work in how humans interact in social systems, but in particular, how those social systems will translate to space colonization. It's likely that Harrison is someone that Bigelow would have met at like the Mars Society or even the Center for like Space Tourism. However, he meets him somehow, obviously.
I love that.
There's also Edgar Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Edgar Mitchell, easily the biggest deal on the team, right? A actual astronaut, big deal, right? Big deal.
A real astronaut.
Yeah, so he is part of NASA's 5th astronaut group. He's in a support crew, and then it's just awesome, right? He's a great guy, super cool, into this stuff. We know he's been into this stuff for a while, or we knew that he was into this stuff for some time. So Edgar Mitchell, big get for NIDS. The next one is Melvin Morse, MD, who is a near-death experiencer, or a near-death experience researcher, in particular a pediatrician. He actually wrote some weird books about like near-death experiences and meeting God and stuff like that. So he's definitely part of this kind of milieu of near-death experience and consciousness studies that Bigelow's doing. Then you have Martin Pilch, PhD, who is a laser scientist from Los Alamos. It's quite sensible to think that he knows this team from either Pudov or John Alexander, who will go on to work at Los Alamos. Mm-hmm. Ted Rockwell, a doctor of science. Again, he is associated with Princeton University in Pear. That's likely how he knows Pudov and Bigelow, is through that kind of Princeton University group that's doing this kind of stuff. He's also a former Navy man, similar to Pudov. John Schuessler, a master of science, big part of MUFON, right? Also another important part of real space history here. But, you know, that's how he gets involved, is through his time in MUFON. It would probably be a good time, or what's the word? He would be good to have kind of his own, his own study on, or his own story on. He's a very interesting person. He was an aerospace engineer before joining up with MUFON. Jessica Utz, PhD, their mathematician. She is involved because of her involvement likely in the Society for Psychical Research. She also is one of the few statisticians who views Hal Puthoff's work positively when the CIA does a study to decide if they're going to continue his funding or not in the 80s. So that's probably how they became friendly and how they met. Jacques Vallée, PhD, you know, super UFO stud. Super obvious how he got involved here. Jim,
I think it's worthy of note, though, just saying, like, that, again, like, he brought all these people together. They're all working with, hypothetically, they're all working with one another. Under no guise or no corporation. There's probably not a real mission statement. There's no academics behind it.
No.
Right? It's like, they're all in a van. They're all in some Scooby van heading out. Like, that's what I think I keep coming back to is like, how would you even harness these people to do anything? You have so many of these, you know, different, some scientists, maybe, you know, again, air quoting some of it, but like you have all of these people. How do you organize them to do anything?
Well,
yeah, just maybe the type A in me getting across, but it's like, that would drive me crazy. You'd be like, where's he went to get coffee or something. And you're like, but we got to go.
Well, there's
an anomaly and da-da-da. Sorry.
We actually end up getting anonymous reports from the ranch that essentially say that exact thing, right? That this is a complete waste of time. We don't do anything. We just sit on our butts. There's no direction. We're not testing anything. We're not doing anything. We're going to get into all that, Marie.
True. But I mean, I think it's interesting to think that you could do that. Like you would just
from the beginning, this is not a very focused team. You know, it's not like they have one psychologist. They have like 5 psychologists. Like why? You know, why do you need 5 psychologists to do these scientific studies? On, you know, if they don't have a single kind of like technician, like a person who is good at measuring audio and video, right? They don't have a single audio and video person on the team. They don't have. They have a couple of laser physicists, sort of still laser physicists, although Puthoff won't do laser physics at this point for like 30 years. You know, they have technical people, but, you know, if you put like the top minds in chemistry in a room today and told them to put together an IKEA table, I don't know if they could do that better than a couple of carpenters. You know, like you need specialization. You need to have a team that's directly good at the stuff you're looking to do. Otherwise, like you said, it's just kind of a milieu of random people. You know,
and you have to like disclose what you're doing. That's the other thing.
If the Justice League is going to fight Manta Ray in the bottom of the ocean, they don't send Batman and the Flash, right? You send Aquaman because he's good at that, because he's got the specialization. That's why the Justice team works.
And they have the organization, right? They have the back end, like they have the management to kind of get these people in place and figure this stuff out. And I feel like that's the other thing is it's like Bigelow never really disclosed anything that I've read with NIDS, like, here's what I want from you. I mean, I think he put out sort of a rough sketch of it, but it's like that's even worse, right? Because it's like there's no way you get all these almost engineer type minds in a room and have them agree on like, okay, this is what we should do.
Well, it's also kind of like
money, throw at it, man. That's
it's cool also kind of. I think it's also kind of funny and hopeful to have a statistician on board when you don't run a single experiment.
I love that.
Like, why have a statistician? You know what I mean? Why have a statistician if there is no? Besides, okay, we don't know for sure that they didn't run experiments. They ran some, of course, But
we are making all sorts of assumptions. It could have been a real finely tuned
right.
machine.
Bigelow might have an alien in his garage right now. We don't know. But
in his multi-car garage in many different locations.
But the challenge is,
some in space.
Even if you think that this stuff is real, why, like, the statistician might be useful at some level, but it seems like kind of a big leap to think that part of what she will be doing is actual statistics on evidence when you know that the chances of an event occurring are super small, even on this ranch that supposedly is super haunted. You know, we're going to get into it on the next episode here, how this doesn't really work. But anyways, there are some other members here. So Jim Winery, MD, PhD, he's a chemist and he's a very kind of a famous flight surgeon at this point in time. His particular work is how the brain responds to getting shut off by G-forces. Like in a cockpit of like a space shuttle.
So why would you have him?
I don't know.
Riddle me this.
He
like,
kind
why
of
would you
came
have
for the
him?
free bagels. I don't know. It's not clear. Then of course Colm Kelleher, PhD. He is the administrator, quote unquote. Although again, those are big air quotes there. He says that he basically gets his start doing immunological research. He works for the Jewish Center for Immunology in Denver, Colorado. Sees this job offering in Science Magazine, decides to join. The thing says, quote, an organization was looking for science managers who were interested in exploring the origin and evolution of consciousness in the universe. So he joins up. Anyways.
And who, like, again, like if you were one of these scientists, you are taking, like, granted it's a good deal of money, but, like, what's the hook? Like, you could make a good deal of money, or at least enough money.
I don't know.
Doing whatever. Like,
I don't even know.
You're like,
I don't even know how much they were. I don't even know how much they were really paid. To be honest, like,
did they get benefits?
Well, that's
unionized.
Based on the Bigelow Glassdoor reviews, their benefits aren't great.
It's not great.
It's not clear.
He yells a lot. He seems like he is volatile.
Yeah,
or at least he has high expectations.
He does. The other person that's involved in all this is Mary Ullman, who is just listed as a staffer on the NIDS website. Who the hell knows what that means?
Well, they've got to do something. Like, again, like, somebody's got to, like, again, office supplies, figure out where the conference rooms are, you know, fix computers. Sorry.
So this is a team of, you know,
a lot
of mostly guys.
Yeah, right? Like, how many total? So, estimated, like, at its heyday, how many total?
So, 14, 15 if you include Bigelow people, one woman, Jessica Utz, with a combined age at this point in the story of about 1,000.
Almost all PhDs. They're all PhDs.
Almost all PhDs. They're at least all masters in some field.
Yes. And some of them are legit versus not. Like, you've got a real astronaut.
And so two of the people that we haven't mentioned are John Alexander, PhD, and Hal Puthoff, PhD, who Hal Puthoff is listed as chairman of the board, a title he will take on again later on for To the Stars Academy, when he is, you know, later on in part of the story. Spoiler alert, listeners. So let's get into these people here a little bit. Now here's the thing, right? Like we've said, this is a group of people who are it's completely not random how these people were brought in, but so we kind of have the people who are involved in parapsychology, right? We have the people who Bigelow knows from legitimate connections, like the University of Nevada and, at this point, essentially the University of Nevada and then Colm Kelleher, right? And then we have the people who are who know him from space tourism, right? Likely that's going to be, Albert Harrison, Jim Winery, those kinds of people there.
I guess.
So,
like, when I look at this list of names, I can't help but wonder, like, is there some other common denominator that we just are not seeing?
They might all
know.
legitimately believe in this stuff.
I don't know, but it's sort of like, again, to have all of these people who, some of them maybe make more sense to be there versus not, but just this huge range. Because again, it's like, if I'm Bigelow, I've got enough money to be relatively selective of the people that I'm bringing into this, and 14 in this field it's not a huge number. I mean, I don't want to call them kooks, right? I know I don't want to say like, but like, let's just pretend, just for the sake of argument, that they're scientists in the biology, whatever the natural science, or they're chemists, or they're engineers, or they're astronauts. So they have you have a kind of a wealth of people that you could draw from, but these are the ones that these are the 14 that you kind of bring together to do this.
Well, it seems...
And that's why I think it's interesting, too. It's like, I don't know if we're missing something. I don't think we are, but...
It seems very much so that... I mean, first off, a lot of those people are going to become extraneous characters. And that sounds crazy to say about, like, say, Edgar Mitchell. That he's the person that gets kind of left out of the cool group. But really, the core of NIDS becomes John Alexander, Hal Puthoff, Schuessler, and Colm Kelleher. Those really become, because these people
no statistician.
These other people are listed as part of the science advisory board. So part of what they're supposed to do, or part of what their mission is supposed to end up being, is you'll do some investigations maybe, but a part of their stated goal appears to have been to actually analyze scientific data as it comes in, to act as a peer review board almost. Since that data never comes to fruition, it's hard to know
that we know of allegedly.
Right. It's hard to know how much of it ends up actually, how much do they really become used in all of this?
I guess.
Based on all of the stories that we have heard, and we're, again, going to get deep into this with the Skinwalker Ranch series next, based on everything we've heard about this, those other people they're not really involved in the same way. It's likely they will eventually bring on, like,
they just got the business cards. Is that what you're saying?
Maybe. I mean, it's hard to know.
Maybe the T-shirt, the NIDS T-shirt.
They will eventually bring on another veterinarian who, because of their interest in, like, cattle mutilations, and she becomes part of like To the Stars Academy too at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. But really, this initial team of kind of like really big names and stuff, it's really hard to know how much do they really contribute to this overall effort. But by the end, I think it's safe to say that they are not really involved anymore. And you get that from, like, Hunt for the Skinwalker, that, the core team is this and the later team is this, that kind of stuff. But
yeah, but the problem I have with Hunt for the Skinwalker is that's one person's account in a lot of ways that has influenced other accounts. You don't hear from Jessica Oates, the statistician.
You hear anonymous stories,
right,
of people writing letters to UFO groups saying we didn't do anything. But that's not the same. That whistleblower has secondhand knowledge.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not good. So
what? I'm just sort of curious because, again, like, it's I forgot, and excuse me as I kind of go down a small rabbit hole, I forgot, like, how many of them there were at NIDS. I was thinking, like, when we were talking about
that's the thing.
I was thinking maybe 6, right?
The core team. The core team becomes those ones that we said.
Well, the core team that we know of, because here's the other thing: it's like, what if these people were involved and we don't have their account because of whatever they found or whatever's been disclosed and publicized, right? I mean, you're saying that, like, Kelleher he's the one who wrote Hunt for Skinwalker, right? So I mean, it's like there's a financial incentive to come out with some of this stuff in some ways as well. I'm just saying that you got a lot of people here that you haven't heard from about what their experience was.
Absolutely,
which would be fascinating.
I agree with you. For sure. That's true.
I'm getting the SUV. I'm getting gas in it. I should be in Minnesota and then we can be in New Mexico probably the next day. Oh.
Yeah, that's not like a 20-hour drive. Anyways, so part of this, and actually the question of how these people all got together is part of a larger conspiracy kind of idea, or a mythology, I guess I should say, because it's hard, again, to tell how much of it is conspiracy versus not. It's part of this idea of Richard Doty, again, of a group known as the Aviary, which is supposedly that group of disinfo agents who, these are UFO researchers, parapsychologists, whatever, essentially like half the NIDS board, who are being given real information about UFO involvement by the U.S. government in exchange for helping to cover up cases and give information to the government about UFO sightings. In the hope, again, of hiding, say, our drone program that was going on in the 80s and 90s. So it's hard to... Part of that mythology is that all of these people are from... All of these people have affiliations with or have worked around military bases in California and Nevada. And so that's how they're connected. They're all part of this kind of circle of people interested in this. What's known initially as the UFO Working Group. That's going to be part of our Patreon episode and our bonus episode that'll come out. But, okay. Let's get into this.
Bum, bum, bum. Sorry. It needed a sound effect, yeah. All right.
It's good stuff. It's good stuff.
Tanya.
So the story here of Hal Puthoff. Let's start with Hal Puthoff. So Harold Puthoff, Hal Puthoff, begins his career as a promising electrical engineer. So he graduates from the University of Florida with an MS in electrical engineering. Then will serve in the Navy. So he works for the NSA, actually, in the early 60s at Fort Meade. His work for the NSA was on the study of fiber optics and lasers. And actually, this goes into that larger conspiracy theory of, while at Fort Meade, he is hired to become part of the Aviary in the UFO Working Group. Anyways, he goes to Stanford eventually to obtain his PhD in 1967. And at Stanford, his research will focus on the use of what's known as a tunable laser and an electron beam devices. So, in the modern day, if you've taken a chemistry course, or if you have a kid who's in high school chemistry right now, Hal Puthoff worked on the technology that would eventually become part of things like, say, Raman spectroscopy. The idea here is that if you can tune the frequency or the energy gap, the band gap between an electron's initial state and its final state as it gets excited in a material, then you can tune the kind of electromagnetic, light, the light wave, essentially, the photon that is released when that material is excited then de-excited. And if you can do that, if you can create a material that has the property where you can change that response, the output, by how much energy you put in or what kind of energy, then you can create a laser beam that you can control much more than lasers up to that point were able to be controlled. Does that kind of make sense, Marie? That explanation?
Yeah, I have to admit I did not get that far in my natural science classes in high school.
So imagine, I guess a good way of explaining this is, imagine like quantum mechanics works like a step for energy, right? So it's kind of similar to if you go to a store where they don't give out change. So you give $1 and, if it's 50 cents, it's $1. If it's 55 cents, it's $1. If it's $1, it's $1. You know what I'm saying? Like, things go by steps. There is no kind of middle ground there. So you either have enough energy or you don't. And so with a laser, the amount of energy that you put into a system like a material lattice will determine, and a lattice is just like a structure, like a crystal or something.
Right. Okay.
The amount of energy that you put into the material will determine how much the electrons in that material can get excited, which means that they will take in that energy, right? So they'll go up in energy, like they'll take in $1. But eventually, the electrons will relax, just naturally. And when they relax, they release that $1 again. And so the amount of energy that it releases, though, is determined by essentially like the chemical structure of the material. in a tunable laser, there are multiple frequencies that you can hit to get different colors, for lack of a better word, of light to release from the laser beam.
Okay, I'm with you.
So imagine, like, instead of plucking like a single guitar string, or rather, let's say this way, instead of just having like a flute that can only play one note, you have a guitar string where, depending on where you place your finger, you can change the output of the sound wave.
Okay.
It's the same kind of way.
I'm with you.
You're
like
inputting.
theremin. It's almost
exactly.
like a theremin in some
You're
ways.
inputting the same amount of energy, but you're getting a different note out. So
Boom.
Hal was working on work where you could create tunable lasers. And the reason that this is important is that different amounts of radiation give different chemical bonds, are like guitar strings. So if you can change the amount of energy that you pluck that guitar string with, you can get different information about the chemicals that are in a structure.
Okay.
That's basically how Raman spec works. So, like, every chemical species has a specific, like, note that it makes when it's plucked with laser energy. But they'll only...
He sounds legit.
He was
What's
super...
your beat?
He
This
was
sounds
super legit at this point. He's so legit at this point.
Sounds legit.
What then happens is Hal goes through some personal traumas. So at this point in time, he's a lecturer in the electrical engineering department at Stanford. He has some students that will graduate with their own PhDs in electrical engineering or applied physics. But, like, Hal's marriage falls apart, and he's kind of finding himself bored with his life and things. And so he ends up joining the Church of Scientology. Oh. Yeah. And so he will then
Tough road to hoe.
He'll
Church
then
of
spend time
Scientology,
as
man.
well at the Assailant Institute, which is a commune. Echelon, whatever the heck it's called, right? A commune that's focused on the human potential movement. So, like, humans can become psychic if they meditate and study enough and whatever.
So, really quick, a quick pop culture note about this for anyone who's seen Mad Men. So the end of Mad Men, and spoiler alert, I'm going to give away the end of Mad Men, where he is when he's thinking about the Coca-Cola commercial that he ends up becoming famous for, is supposed to be Essalon.
Oh, interesting. That's cool.
Yeah.
So at this point,
it's a big hippie thing. Yeah,
it is a huge hippie thing at this point. No, it absolutely is. It's a huge thing, and frankly, it's a big part of L. Ron Hubbard's whole Scientology thing, right? It's how he's getting some people to join Scientology, is saying, like, well, we have the answers to that stuff, right? So at this point in time, L. Ron Hubbard is trying desperately to find any kind of scientific corroboration for the stuff in Dianetics. And so specifically,
good luck, buddy.
Specifically the ability to turn normal people into psychics, to have the ability to do remote viewing, to have telekinetic powers, to be able to communicate telepathically, all this kind of stuff. And Pudov is at the wrong place at the wrong time. He is, going through things that are hard to deal with generally. And then he has this, frankly, cult leader be like, come hang out with us. We got the answers, right?
Yep.
And so 1970, he obtains a patent on his Raman laser. He's 33 at this point in time in 1970. But at the same time, he writes a notarized letter describing how great the E-meter is. So the E-meter, for those that don't know, is a device used in Scientology to measure your, like, thetan levels, the aliens eating your...
You want to get into what a thetan level is?
I don't think we should get into it too much. It's like psychic negative energy, but it's actually aliens on your mind or something. South Park did a surprisingly good rundown on all of it, to be honest.
They did. They were tight with that.
Anyway, so the letter is notarized. It's written by Hal Pudov. So he says, quote, "Although critics viewing the system, Scientology, from the outside may form the impression that Scientology is just another of many quasi-educational, quasi-religious schemes, it is in fact a highly sophistical and highly technological system more characteristic of the best modern corporate planning and applied technology, end quote.
Is it?
Yeah,
Is
so
it, though?
he falls for Scientology super hard. And so by 1971, he reaches the stage of OT 7 in Scientology, which is operating thetan level 7, which was the highest level possible at that point. And at this point, he is now claiming that he himself is psychic. He can perform remote viewing feats. There's one particular case where he says that he can read, what was it? I think this was him, but there's a story of standing outside a building and reading the directory inside the building, and then going in and finding that it's right. So he completely gives up, essentially, on physics.
Convenient.
And jumps to, yeah, very convenient, right? Do they have donuts in there? You know, is the frosty machine working in Wendy's?
It is my dentist. Is it on the second floor? It's on the second floor.
Right, super useful. So he completely abandons his promising electrical engineering career and decides to focus on parapsychology, specifically remote viewing. So he joins what's known as the SRI, or the Stanford Research Institute, which is, essentially his work is focusing on the biofield, which is the physical quasi-science that's supposed to explain how the e-meter works. Like the ability of the human mind to extend that biofield out to see things at a distance, to affect things at a distance, all that kind of crap. So, his joining, though, with SRI coincides with it losing all of its affiliation with Stanford University, as well as all of its funding. So, which sucks for him joining up, but it's hilarious that they still use the name Stanford. They completely split with Stanford because students find out that the programs at SRI are being funded by DARPA and the CIA. And so they don't want any part in, like, the military-industrial complex's weird, attempts to create psychic soldiers and crap. And that sounds like I'm being flippant. I'm not being flippant. We're going to get into that in a couple minutes.
It's the 70s. They were doing that stuff.
All kinds of crazy crap.
Yeah. It was also disclosed in a lot of that was disclosed in the church committee.
Yes, absolutely. So, 1972, he performs easily his most famous work with Russell Targ on the investigation of psychic phenomena for the CIA. The experiment basically focuses on two different methods. One is the collection of data from a remote point, also known as remote viewing, and the other one is the manipulation of the effects of a random system, which that's psychokinetics. So that's basically the same experiment that was done at Pear, right? The Princeton anomalous, whatever the heck it was. He, at this point in time, he studies a lot of celebrities. He studies Uri Geller, Ingo Swann, and just like random people, but a lot of them are Scientologists because he thinks that they're really psychic, so he thinks they're good hits, right?
You're gonna put this out there, you gotta go big, you gotta go with Geller.
Yeah. The study actually ends up
the gold
being
standard, 70s.
The study actually ends up being published in the journal Nature, which is one of the most important scientific journals in the world. It is the most important, not one of. It's the most important, right? It's like Nature, then Science, then others. But the thing that people don't talk about in how it was published in Nature was that it was published against a backdrop of just comically significant backlash, both from other researchers at SRI who said that the results were fraudulent and against other scientists who studied it, saying that it's a terrible piece of scientific work. So it being
had to have an article in the same edition.
They did.
Like, can you imagine that's what you're all excited and it comes out and it's behind that?
So when it was published, actually, the editor of Nature took an extraordinary step, which was publishing an editorial explaining why they decided to publish this work and giving context around some of the reviewer comments so that people would understand what this work actually meant. And so I'm going to read some of that right now. So the whole thing is pretty long, and we're going to publish the whole thing for you so you can read it without the paywall being there. But here's how it starts. So, quote, we published this week a paper by Drs. R. Targ and H. Pudoff, page 602, which is bound to create something of a stir in the scientific community. The claim is made that information can be transferred by some channel whose characteristics appear to fall outside the range of known perceptual modalities. Or, more bluntly, some people can read thoughts or see things remotely. Such a claim is, of course, bound to be greeted with a preconditioned reaction among many scientists. To some, it simply confirms what they have always known or believed. To others, it is beyond the laws of science and therefore necessarily unacceptable. But to a few, though perhaps to more than is realized, the questions are still unanswered, and any evidence of high quality is worth a critical examination. The issue then is whether the evidence is of sufficient quality to be taken seriously. In trying to answer this, we have been fortunate in having the help of 3 independent referees who have done their utmost to see the paper as a potentially important scientific communication and not as a challenge to or confirmation of prejudices. A general indication of the referees' comments may be helpful to readers in reaching their own assessment of the paper. Of the 3, one believed we should not publish, one did not feel strongly either way, and the third was guarded in favor of publication. We first summarize the arguments against the paper. And so the arguments against the paper, essentially, the first one is that the paper, all referees believe that the paper was weak in design and presentation, to the extent that details given as to the precise way in which the experiment was carried out were disconcertingly vague. The referees felt that insufficient account had been taken of the established methodology of experimental psychology, and that in the form originally submitted, the paper would be unlikely to be accepted for publication in a psychological journal on these grounds alone. And actually, that is borne out
shouldn't it be thrown out right there?
And that, it was thrown out by many journals first. It was not accepted in any psychological journal.
So, yeah, okay. So who did he know? Who did they know it? Like, why do you think Nature did this? Because to your point, it is the biggest.
We're going to get to that. Okay. We'll continue. Right. Yeah. So two. The 3 referees were particularly critical of the method of target selection used, pointing out that the choice of a target by opening a dictionary at random is a naive, vague, and unnecessarily controversial approach to randomization. Parapsychologists have long rejected such methods of target selection, and, as one referee put it, weaknesses of this kind reveal a lack of skill in their experiments, which might have caused them to make some other mistake, which is less evident from their writing. So, that will go into greatly problem 3. All the referees felt that the details given of various safeguards and precautions introduced against the possibility of conscious or unconscious fraud on the part of one or other of the subjects were uncomfortably vague. This in itself might be sufficient to raise doubt that the experiments have demonstrated the existence of a new channel of communication which does not involve the use of the senses.
Really quickly, stickers for any of our listeners that can tweet out hashtag uncomfortably vague was something that they had to do this week. That's my favorite. That is my favorite.
It's a pretty good one. And then
it's uncomfortably vague.
And then 2 of the referees felt that it was a pity that the paper, instead of concentrating in detail and with meticulous care on one particular approach to extrasensory phenomena, produced a mixture of different experiments, using different subjects in unconnected circumstances and with only a tenuous overall theme. Yep. So then they say, on their own, these highly critical comments could be grounds for rejection of the paper, but it was felt that other points needed to be taken into account before a final decision could be made. First, the paper is presented as a scientific document by 2 qualified scientists. 2, the authors have clearly attempted to investigate under laboratory conditions, phenomena which, while highly implausible to many scientists, would nevertheless seem to be worthy of investigation, even if, in the final analysis, negative findings are revealed. Third, very considerable advanced publicity, it is fair to say not generated by the authors or their institute, has preceded the presentation of this report. As a result, many scientists and very large numbers of non-scientists believe, as the result of anecdote and hearsay, that the Stanford Research Institute was engaged in a major research program into parapsychological matters and had even been the scene of a remarkable breakthrough in this field. The publication of this paper, with its muted claims, suggestions of a limited research program, and modest data, is, we believe, likely to out the whole matter in a more reasonable perspective.
Okay.
And then two of the referees also felt that the paper should be published because it would allow parapsychologists and other scientists interested in this field to gauge the quality of the Stanford research and assess how much it is contributing to parapsychology. And then Nature said that essentially they believe their readers expect them to produce occasional high-risk papers.
Ooh, so this is them going out on the limb.
Yeah. So essentially, they also then say here, I think importantly here, is that they say publishing in a scientific journal is not a process of receiving a seal of approval from the establishment. Rather, it is the serving of notice on the community that there is something worthy of their attention and scrutiny. So they're essentially saying that this is worth looking at because, first off, to kind of quell some of the claims about SRI, but also because this is a legitimate attempt, they would say, to show this. However, even with its publication, the paper is met with extreme ridicule. Both Targ and Puthoff are completely convinced of the results, but it becomes quickly apparent that there are various clues hidden in the tests themselves, which artificially increase the chances of a hit. And this is actually proven out later. Other parapsychologists do studies. So David Marks and Richard Kahneman both attempt to replicate the results, but aren't able to do so after they remove the cues from the testing protocols. So, yeah, it's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And so
they consciously or unconsciously rigged it.
Yes. So they say here, quote, this is from Thomas Gilovich, a psychologist at Cornell, quote, most of the material in the transcripts consists of the honest attempts by the participants to describe their impressions. However, the transcript also contained a considerable extraneous material that could aid a judge in matching them to the correct targets. So, for instance, the way that this test worked, and so this is actually from a response from Puthoff and Targ, right?
Right.
So, okay, here's how it works. This is a quote from their paper. This is from SRI, submitted for publication in Nature, Information or Transmission in Remote Viewing Experiments 2, Reanalysis of SRI Remote Viewing Experiments by Charles Tart, again, that same guy that worked with Bigelow. So, quote, at the beginning of an experiment, one experimenter is closeted with a subject to await an agreed-upon start time. A second experimenter is then sent by random number access to a previously prepared target pool, to a target location in the San Francisco Bay Area, an area of approximately 250 square kilometers. During a predetermined 30-minute viewing period, the subject is asked to render drawings and describe into a tape recorder his impressions of the target site being visited by the outbound experimenter. The experimenter remaining with the subject is kept ignorant of both the particular target and the contents of the target pool, and is therefore free to question the subject to clarify his descriptions without fear of cueing, overt or subliminal. Following a series of such experiments over a several-day period, the data are given to independent judges for various forms of blind analysis, such as correlation of target/transcript descriptors, blind matching, etc. In the blind matching procedure, which provides an overall estimate of target/transcript correlations, a judge attempts to blind match transcripts to target sites. Now, what happens is that some of those judging protocols give evidence of what sites are being visited when. So because it's not a purely random process, and in fact the judges know what the list of
San
sites...
Francisco.
Yeah, because the judges are actually given a list of the possible sites at the beginning. Because of this, and because they almost comically send people to the sites in the order that they are on that list of sites, people are able to figure out how to place the transcripts in proper sequence. And actually, in the stuff that the judges are given, there's references to like dates and times, and so it'll say like, after we visited site 7 or something, right? So it's not as like clear as that. It's not as obvious as that. However, the sequence with which they study these things is easily figured out from the list of places and then the kind of cues hidden in the document that weren't edited out correctly.
Yeah, basically, it's rigged.
Yes, essentially.
You're rigging it. You're rigging it, whether you know it or not.
So, 1974 now. Pudov publishes a success story in Celebrity Magazine, a Scientology publication. He says, quote, "Having totally completed Dianetic auditing, I must say I have an incredibly good feeling about creating life games, my ability to play them hard and well, and a feeling of absolute fearlessness." End quote. So, hey, good, man. He's feeling good. That's great.
Good up on ya.
Late 1970s, he continues his work with SRI under the new name of Project Stargate. This is founded in 1978 in Fort Meade, Maryland. And this is a joint venture between the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, and the SRI International. Essentially, they are studying psychic phenomena for applications in Defense Department projects and needs. This is likely where he meets John Alexander and the cast of characters of the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats, which is actually loosely based on John Alexander. One of the people that Bigelow hires is his scientist. So good stuff.
Yeah. Not so loosely. It's completely based on
completely,
him.
Completely 100% based on them. So
there's no loosely. I think they even take the title from his work.
Yeah. However, very quickly,
Allegedly.
you know what's funny? You know what's funny about that, actually? In John Alexander's quotes about the Men Who Stare at Goats, he's like, that whole scene where they look at the goat to kill it, that's all just bullcrap. We actually use the, one-finger death punch technique. It's like, that makes more sense. That sounds more reasonable.
Do you see how you're not adding credibility when you say the words one-finger death punch?
Yeah,
it's not
good.
Get you closer. That doesn't get you closer, man.
So Project Stargate's funding, though, dries up in the mid-1980s. And so, and somewhere in this time period, Pudov quit Scientology. We don't know why. Maybe it's because of his connection with, the government suddenly that, because L. Ron Hubbard was really worried about,
taxes.
He was really worried about, taxes, but he was really concerned about... He was really concerned about government agents infiltrating Scientology and taking it over, or, using it and investigating and whatever. So you can imagine Pudov is really high up. There aren't that many OT7s at the time. Pudov is essentially where Tom Cruise is now. He's super high up. He's a scientist. He's a jewel in their cap, really. So it's not clear if
they let him go. That's the other interesting thing is the more you know about Scientology is the more of it they kind of make it very difficult for you to leave. That's the thing.
I kind of wonder if they did let him go. I kind of wonder if, I don't know, he stops talking about it, and it appears he stopped being a Scientologist, but, his views on this stuff haven't really changed. You know what I mean?
That's an interesting story.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story, and it's one that I would love to get to the bottom of, but after this episode, I doubt very much how Pudov's going to talk to us.
Oh, yeah. Well, we had that shot before.
So anyways, the program, essentially, its funding dries up in the 80s, and so Pudov leaves, but eventually it fully dries up in the 1990s. And that's because it is analyzed by, well, not because of this, but so in the 90s it transfers over from being a DIA project to being a CIA project. And then the CIA, the guy who was funding this, John Alexander's kind of mentor, the major general who's he's working under, is forced out of the army because of his belief in psychics and stuff. And the guy that comes in next is much more grounded and is like, why is our goat budget so high? why are we, who spent $1 million on
for a one-finger punch?
Right, yeah, who spent $1 million on crystals? This doesn't make any goddamn sense. So they move to more traditional, that's the way that it's listed on the website, more traditional security analysis tools. And so they basically do an audit of the psychic program. And so part of that, though, is actually Jessica Utz and psychologist John Hyman for the CIA performing a review of the results of the Stargate experiment. And so she basically says that the results of this are a compelling argument to continue the program within the intelligence community. But John Hyman says it's complete crap. So he says, quote, the laboratory studies do not, or this is actually from, this is from the executive summary called An Evaluation of Remote Viewing Research and Applications from the American Institutes for Research, published in 1999. Quote, the laboratory studies do not provide evidence they address an important, the laboratory studies do not provide evidence regarding the origins or nature of the phenomena, assuming it exists, nor do they address an important methodological issue of interjudge reliability, that same issue that Puthoff had before. Further, even if it could be demonstrated unequivocally that a paranormal phenomena occurs under the conditions present in the laboratory paradigm, these conditions have limited applicability and utility for intelligence gathering operations. For example, the nature of the remote viewing targets are vastly dissimilar, as are the specific tasks required of the remote viewers. Most importantly, the information provided by remote viewing is vague and ambiguous, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the technique to yield information of sufficient quality and accuracy of information for actionable intelligence. Thus, we conclude that continued use of remote viewing in intelligence gathering operations is not warranted, end quote. So, interestingly here, his argument is a pragmatic one. You know, it's like, imagine you're a remote viewer. They're like, "Where's Osama bin Laden?" And you're like, "He's in a cave." That doesn't help me.
He's in San Francisco. Wait, no, yeah. Well,
exactly. Like, unless it's like he's on the Eiffel Tower. It's, it's hard to, even in a house. Like, how would you ever? Just think about that, right? How would you ever pinpoint where someone is by remote viewing?
And it's just not. It's just still too fringe, right? For the people that are going to be coming in that are going to, like you said, if it's a different administration, if it's a different structure, they're not going to be like, oh yeah, this sounds good. Let's keep giving money to this.
Right.
They're going to have a different agenda.
It's likely that not likely. The guys that came in after kind of John Alexander and the other team, the men who stare at goats guys, likely never dropped acid with L. Ron Hubbard. So it kind of makes sense. It just never happened.
Like they're probably actually soldiers and officers trained in, warfare and the military, and they probably had some very valid ways of looking about how to gather intelligence versus a wonder-fingered punch and goats. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like, I can see that. I'm going to give that to them.
Not to say, again, we're being a little flippant. John Alexander's story is actually super badass. And so is the story of the people around him. Super badass. Like, it's actually super cool. So, it's funny that he did this kind of stuff, but like, he actually did it. That's super cool. We almost had psychic armies. Now, okay, so close. Let's close out Puthoff here. So 85, he founds Earth Tech International in Austin, Texas, as well as the Institute for Advanced Studies at Austin, which has absolutely no affiliation with the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton University. It appears that he learned, it appears like similar with SRI, where they were no longer affiliated with Stanford, but still kept the name Stanford on there. It appears that the power of a famous name is really important, so why not use it?
We don't have to be psychic to know that. Psychic to know that branding's going to work better. Yeah.
Essentially, he founded a company called, like, the Massachusetts Institute of Technocracy, and he called it MIT, and he put it that way on his resume and on his CV and everything else. So at this point, he starts to shift his focus over to zero-point energy research, although he's still super involved in psychic research. That never really stops. And even his study of zero-point energy, it's still kind of psychic. Like, his psychic stuff never ends. it's likely that at this point in time, like we said, he was working on this project Stargate, which was part of John Alexander's purview, and part of the purview of Alexander's chain of command. So it's likely that that is where Alexander met Puthoff. Where he met Bigelow, it's a little bit harder to say. Although, again, Bigelow in the 80s was already doing this kind of funding. He was already looking for people. When he did that Chair of Consciousness studies, they did like a nationwide search for researchers. It would be very surprising to me if Puthoff did not come up as an option in that search. And honestly, like one part of this story that I would actually love to know is, did Bigelow ever get involved in Scientology? Do you know what I mean?
A waste of money. Absolutely not.
You think so? I don't know. I think it's so fascinating.
God, no. Nope.
I wonder if he would have. I wonder though if he would not have at least, like, my mom. It's funny. My mom, when I was a kid, my mom has all these like books on weird stuff and whatever. And one of the books she has is Dianetics, and evidently she was like given it on the street in New York City.
And Dora's like, what is this?
Yeah, she was like, what the hell is this crap? But so she has the book, and she, like, it's so funny that, I was almost Ashton Kutcher, not Ashton Kutcher, who's that guy from That 70s Show that was a Scientologist, or is a Scientologist?
Oh, yeah. I don't know his name. Oh.
Anyways.
Yeah.
So, this is where, though, he would have been introduced to those folks. So, and essentially that's where it is now. He's still, now he's part of NIDS, right? This is the point.
See, I think that Bigelow's way too practical. He's way too practical of a person to get involved in Scientology. Oh yeah. I for some reason I don't know why I feel that way, but I'm relatively certain that it just, again, there's too much pseudo faux kind of, I don't want to say, like, he's not cult person. Like, he's not going to follow, right?
Yeah.
To buy into Scientology, you got to follow, and he's not a follower. He's not going to buy into any of the the mythos around it. And I think that that's the other thing too, is with a lot of the things surrounding him, he's not interested in the mythos or the story so much around it. I mean, he has his own little, the little origin stories, but that doesn't really seem what interests him. What's interesting to him is the mechanics. Like, yes. How does it work? I don't care if if they prayed to the sun and then the sun god brought them up to heaven. None of that is interesting. And I have to follow the sun god if I want to do this. What was the mechanism in which they transcended? So I don't think that he buys into any of that other stuff.
I would agree with you.
My 2 cents.
No, I totally agree with you. So Puthoff ends up really only publishing a very small amount of research after kind of finishing in electrical engineering. He's publishing some stuff on what's the word? He's publishing some stuff on, psychic things and whatever. But essentially, though, a lot of his work is at this point in time non peer reviewed, like non-scientifically peer reviewed, right? He's publishing white papers and stuff from Earth Tech and the Institute for Advanced Studies. He's doing some 0-point energy work, but really that's not even really being taken very seriously by it's 0-point energy is an interesting field because it's close enough to we did an episode on 0-point energy already, but it requires quantum mechanics to be fundamentally wrong. And so it's an idea that has been and besides quantum mechanics having to be fundamentally wrong, thermodynamics also has to be fundamentally wrong, because you're pulling energy from you are by definition breaking the second law of thermodynamics. You're pulling energy from a fully freely available energy source without any entropic losses. Yeah, so it's essentially like a perpetual motion machine kind of idea. So an energy dissipates by nature, right? That's what the second law of energy says. Energy will dissipate in transfer. Right. So
how is what he's doing any different than like snake oil salesman? Honestly, with a lot of this stuff.
So the thing is that it's similar to, like, say, the multiple worlds hypothesis, right? there you can still do mathematics about 0 point energy. You can still publish papers on it, but the physical reality of it, no one takes seriously, right? There are still Marie, there are still people publishing papers about
flat Earth.
Yeah, about not the flat Earth,
self.
but about I'm trying to think of like a good example, like climate change denial, right? There are people publishing papers on climate change denial still.
Yes.
They're small fringe communities.
I think my whole thing is what's fascinating to me is you go from something that is, again, sort of that he had a path or a future or something that was a bit more, I don't want to say traditional or known, and it's like Scientology and then 0 point energy is sort of, again, just, I don't know, to me it equates roughly into snake oil salesman. Like you're making something into something that is hypothetical and maybe someday could be proven, but not into any sort of, I don't know.
Well, sorry. I'm with you. Like he was working on a field of physics that would become intensely important. Like he legitimately was working at the forefront of physics. And then there's an article, I can't remember where it's from. It's linked in the notes here, but I think there's an article that has the perfect name for it, right? How did Hal Puthoff let Scientology ruin a promising scientific career? That's kind of true. So
I mean, even when you're going back and evaluating this stuff with Uri Geller, why not do it scientifically correct? Why cut corners?
He believed it so much, I think, that it seemed scientifically correct, and it's unfortunate. And so the thing is that too, the 0 point energy work is, I think actually we'll get to this later on when we talk about the transition to the Stars Academy for Puthoff, but. What's actually really interesting is the field is so small. It's literally like Puthoff, Eric Davis, one of his buddies, and like 2 other people doing research into 0 point energy, and they all have similar kind of paths to Puthoff. So it's like the field of scholarship doing this kind of work is very tenuous to begin with. And so, but it follows from a strong history. It's like, it's a field that's fallen out of favor. But like Einstein talked about, like the voluminous ether, right? This idea of or Einstein kind of broke that idea apart. But like pre-Einstein, right? There was this idea of the voluminous ether, which was this, like space-time wasn't like a fabric
linear,
of reality, right? That, gravity is space-time bending in on a heavy object or a massive object that pushes it down. And so as you move, both time and space contract in different ways. Before that, the voluminous ether was the explanation for like how gravity worked and everything else. There were still papers about the voluminous ether going on after Einstein. Like Hal Puthoff is like a weird holdover kind of scientist working in a field that is not, it's just not going to live past him. As depressing as that sounds, but like that's the truth of it, though. That's the way that some of these scientific, it's like the people that were still publishing papers on Lamarckian genetics after the Soviet Union fell, like that.
You lost me there on that one, but
it takes a long time for paradigms to shift, right? And his just hasn't yet. In some ways, his paradigm has shifted so hard that he Scientologied himself into psychic powers. But in some other ways, his paradigm has not shifted at all from like pre-60s physics. Anyways, so Colonel John Alexander, his story is so, honestly, I think he needs an episode all on his own. But we're gonna give the kind of the quick story here. He joins the Army as a private in 1956. He becomes selected for officer school as a sergeant. And so eventually will reach the rank of colonel. Evidently, if you get chosen for the Army, officer school as an enlisted man, you're called a Mustang, I guess. So like all of his biographies start with
Macho.
like John Alexander is a Mustang. It's like, okay, that's cool, I guess. So
Macho.
He has degrees in sociology from the University of Nebraska, and a master's degree and a PhD in education. The master's from Pepperdine and the PhD from Walden University. And his PhD he'll gain it in 1980. Now, his Army assignments there's a bunch of them, and honestly, Wikipedia does a great job here, so we're just going to read from Wikipedia. So he's a commander in the Army Special Forces team in Vietnam and Thailand from 66 to 69. He then becomes the Chief of Human Resources Division for the Army at Fort McPherson in Georgia from 77 to 79. He is the Inspector General for the Department of the Army, Washington from 80 to 82. Chief of Human Technology.
Crazy.
It's absolutely crazy.
Inspector General is a legit, real job.
Yeah. He becomes the Chief of Human Technology in the Army Intelligence Command in Arlington, Virginia from 82 to 83. Then the Manager of Technology Integration for the Army Materiel Command from 83 to 85. Then the Director for the Advanced Concepts U.S. Army Lab at Command at Adelphi, Maryland from 85 to 88. And then he will go on to work for Lockheed Martin. Essentially, kind of continuing that, what's the word? That
shadowy.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah, basically, right? So, yeah.
Shadowy government, sort of, the dark underbelly.
Yeah, so Martin. It's a very interesting one, right? It's a very interesting career here. So, yeah, he ends up becoming, what's the word? He ends up becoming the manager for non-lethal. Oh, sorry, not Lockheed Martin. Sorry, that's wrong here. Jake, take that out. So he retires from the Army in like the 80s, like mid 80s, late 80s, and will go on to become the manager for non-lethal defense programs at Los Alamos National Lab. And so his work there is on non-lethal warfare, which is super interesting, and that's kind of his main thing there.
Right, that's the sonic weapon.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep, he helps to work on the sonic weapons. Absolutely. So he claims that he was always interested in esoteric concepts and ideas and stuff, but really his use of those in the Army is brought on by connections to two men, Jim Channon and Albert Stubblebean, which Stubblebean is the cutest name for a tiny bear.
It is. Hello, Mr. Stubblebean.
So Channon famously is the main character basis for The Men Who Stare at Goats. He creates what's known as the First Earth Battalion memorandum or kind of note, note or whatever memo, which is a description of a theoretical, or maybe not so theoretical since they end up trying some of this crazy stuff, like a group of warrior monks for the U.S. Army. So his whole idea is we can develop human potential to the point that our soldiers can, talk telepathically and get remote viewing information from afar and, a crazy kind of thing, right? He interestingly will eventually become the world's first corporate shaman, is what he is called, basically. Which I wouldn't be very...
corporation, I wonder?
He went to all kinds of ones, he went to a bunch of legit corporations, like AT&T, Ford, a whole bunch of places, right? I would actually be very surprised if he didn't go to Bigelow Aerospace. I would be very surprised. So, anyways,
you think?
Absolutely, I would guarantee that he went to Bigelow.
Do you ever watch? Sorry, not pop culture reference number 2. Silicon Valley.
Yes, he's that guy. He's the guy.
That's right. He's the spiritual, the semi-spiritual shaman advisor to the main villainous, the villain character. I can't remember the guy's name.
I know who you mean. The guy that's like the Facebook guy or Moogly or whatever it's called. Moogly. Anyways.
Hooli, yeah.
Hooli, there we go. So, Channon is an interesting guy.
Him.
We should have our own episode on him and this next guy too. So the other guy is Stubblebean. So he becomes an Army Major General, and he was really the one who was pushing these ideas of psychic warfare, and remote viewing and all this kinds of stuff. So he was the one who really pushed the ideas of Channon and Alexander. He becomes one of the key sponsors of the Stargate project that Puthoff was working on. Famously, he attempted in the 80s to create a group of super powerful psychic soldiers who could walk through walls was like one of their main claims. And actually, Stubblebean evidently did in fact try to walk through a wall once and could not do it. That's part of like the men who stare at goats. Evidently, that's a real thing. He actually tried to do that.
You know why?
Why?
It's a wall. It's a wall. It has
Is that why, Marie?
It's a wall. Like,
so,
I don't know. I feel like, okay, I don't, so this is not political when I say this, but, you have men and women that serve our country that come back that have to wait, to get into the VA for and have their files lost in the VA and have like, antiquated systems to keep people who serve our country healthy. And then you have jokers like this that are wanting to walk through a wall. Like, again, there's got to be some sort of middle ground.
No,
right?
this is 100% for me a story of government corruption. Like, again, we've said this with TTSA too, right? The fact that Harry Reid could buy his friend a government research program into UFOs is a tremendous scandal. That should never happen in a free country.
Yeah. I mean, and money should be put. Just our 2 cents.
No, yeah, absolutely. So, anyways, all of the work, or a lot of the work that Stubblebean worked on was through the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, or INSCOM. And again, he's eventually forced out of the Army in '84. He's forced into retirement essentially because of all of his psychic ideas and stuff, and they're just not part of the time period anymore.
Trying to walk into one too many walls?
Maybe, I don't know. Well, actually, there's a funny anecdote that supposedly he really offended another like a politician or something, or another person in the Army, because that person was very religious, like Christian, and he thought that Stubblebean was a demon worshiper. He thought that he was involved in witchcraft. And that's like one of many anecdotes about how this guy like was just a complete badass. Like, Stubblebean is the man. But anyways, and so essentially at this point now, Stubblebean is retired. John Alexander leaves the Army. He gets a lot of accolades for his work and stuff. I mean, he did do the stuff he was told to do. You know what I mean? He was a good soldier. Seems to have been just overall a cool guy. Like, all in interviews with him, he seems super fascinating. Like, I would love to talk to him. But, so he goes on to study non-lethal weapons like we talked about. He starts calling himself a thanatologist, like a scientist of death. Again, completely badass. And
to me, he is a little bit more, he's a good storyteller. Like, when we did Skinwalker, I watched some of his retelling of certain stories. I'm like, yeah, he's pretty good. He tells a good story.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
Absolutely.
He's charismatic in that way.
He ends up, so his wife ends up working for Bigelow in the Bigelow Foundation, and Alexander also helps to it's not super clear, but seems to have helped to have started that MIT research conference. And he's certainly involved with Bigelow at, again, that Alexander study of kind of religious response to UFOs and stuff. So, and that's how he meets Bigelow. And so, really, these two guys, Puthoff and Alexander, become a really important part of overall UFO mythology in the modern day. Like, Puthoff is a part of To the Stars Academy. He is pointed out as a beacon of unbiased, quiet, careful scientific analysis. And I think his history speaks for itself. To be
I would tend to agree with you.
Yeah, it's a little hard to make that claim that, this is someone we should be listening to. And on top of that too, it's interesting that this would be the team again that would kind of crystallize around Bigelow, because this is a guy again who has so much money and he has a lot of real influence, and he chooses, I don't know.
So these are the people that are very evident that he has put forward in this. Like, again, like I think there may be something to that. Like, we only know that they have this association because they have made it public that they had this association. in a lot of ways, right? And it's like they've made public what they have done in, or they have disclosed more about what they have done to help their own sort of mythos and story. But again, like what if they're not really the story? What if they're just, again, the subterfuge?
Absolutely. No, you're completely correct, right? Part of this story, or part of all of this that we have to keep in mind, is we know the parts of this that some of the stuff in this, it took a lot of digging to get to, you can imagine. But some of it is very out on the surface. And that's the part that they probably want you to see. And so that is why I think it's really important to keep in mind this possibility that a lot of this might actually be non-conspiracy misinformation.
Yes, or one side of the story for sure.
And so, basically, that is the founding of NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science. And so the scientists are all hired by 1996, and then they will begin their study of a facility that will go on to legend to be known as the Skinwalker Ranch.
So they're packing up their bags, right? They're getting all their gear together to go to Utah.
And that, dear listeners, is where we will pick up next episode.
That is if we make it.
We gonna die, Marie!
No.
No, we'll be fine. All right. Good night, listeners.
Good night.
Thank you again, dear listeners, for listening to the Mad Scientist podcast. I have been your host, Chris Cogswell, joined by my co-host,
Marie Mayhew.
If you'd like to contact the show, please send us an email at themadscientistpodcast@gmail.com. That's all one word. You can also follow us on Twitter at Mad Scientist Pod or at Team Giant Squid for Marie. And of course, you can see us on Facebook, on Instagram, and all over the internet as the Mad Scientist Podcast. And again, our logo is the one with the pumpkin head, so it's easy to see. If you've enjoyed the show tonight, please consider supporting us on Patreon, where the money that you give to us will help us to promote this show further, to make it better, and just to spend more time making it.
Because we love doing that.
We do love doing that. Our logo was designed by Carrie Shaheen. Our web design is done by Desdemona Howard.
Woohoo!
And our sound design is done by Jake Cardinal. Thanks again for listening.
Thank you. This has been a Damn It Chippy production.